Every year, Forbes scours the globe looking for every billionaire on the planet. And this year, even amid the war in Ukraine, Chinese tech crackdown, and markets that are struggling kind of all around the globe, we still found 2,668 billionaires. They're worth a collective $12.7 trillion. That's with a T, which is an incredible amount of money, but actually $400 billion less than they were worth last year. And there are 87 fewer billionaires in the world than last year. There are a lot of billionaires behind decacorn companies, which are companies that are valued at least $10 billion. It used to be that if you were a venture-funded company and you hit $1 billion in valuation, you were called a unicorn, and it was extremely impressive. And these days, $1 billion is kind of not enough. The really impressive metric is decacorns, companies that are worth at least 10 billion. And we found something like 30 decacorns, and there are billionaires behind a lot of those. Another major trend with billionaires this year is that oil and gas and energy billionaires are doing extremely well. I mean, you see high prices at the pump. The billionaires behind oil and gas are just really thriving these days. Global supply chain issues have made it difficult to get all sorts of goods, like we all know. And a lot of companies have warned their investors that their bottom lines might be impacted by these supply chain issues. But there's always someone somewhere profiting, no matter what's going on in the world. And in this case, it's shipping and logistics companies who are really having banner years and record profits. And that's adding billions of dollars to the fortunes of the billionaires behind those companies. People like Klaus Michael Kuna and Gianluigi and Raffaella Aponte. So despite everything that's going on in the world, more than 1,000 billionaires are richer than they were a year ago. And no one got richer over the past year than Elon Musk, who tops the billionaires list for the first time ever. Musk is worth $219 billion this year, which is $68 billion more than he was worth a year ago, thanks to soaring Tesla stock. Behind Elon Musk is Jeff Bezos, who is the second richest person in the world with $171 billion to his name. After Bezos is Bernard Arnault, who's worth $158 billion, then Bill Gates at number 4 with $129 billion. And Warren Buffett is the 5th richest person in the world this year, worth $118 billion. While there are a lot of billionaires who are doing really well, there are some that are not doing so well. And one group of billionaires that are in general not doing very well would be Russian billionaires.
So an oligarch generally refers to people who are very wealthy business people who have some kind of political or social influence. When it comes to Russia specifically, we often look at sort of 2 time periods in which oligarchs arose. One is the original oligarchs who made their fortunes in the 1990s during the very chaotic privatization era after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when a lot of state assets were sold to private investors on the cheap, especially through a now infamous voucher system under President Boris Yeltsin. And then there was sort of another wave of oligarchs that arose after Vladimir Putin rose to power in 2000. A lot of the people in that group tended to be individuals who had close ties to Putin from the early 90s or even before then, and who were able to enrich themselves thanks to their close ties to Putin. Generally, right, oligarch is people who still have political influence, but that can also sort of refer to how they made their fortune. Some original oligarchs from the 1990s then fell out of favor, actually, when Putin was in power, but they were still oligarchs. The war in Ukraine has had a pretty significant impact on the wealth of oligarchs that we track at Forbes. We estimate that there's around 89 oligarchs in Russia, several of whom have actually been sanctioned recently. By our estimates, these oligarchs were worth a collective $290 billion on March 11, which is the date that we finalized the valuations for our 2022 World Billionaires list. And we estimate that they've lost around $240 billion, so nearly half of their pre-war net worth since January, before the war began. So the richest person in Russia, and also the richest person we consider an oligarch in Russia, is Vladimir Lysin, and we currently estimate his net worth at $18.4 billion. For context, he was worth around $31 billion before the war began in January. Vladimir Lysin rose to fame sort of in the 1990s when he was cutting his teeth in the brutal aluminum wars. Today, Leeson draws his fortune from the NLMK Group, which is a very large manufacturer of steel products. So since the war began, several assets owned by sanctioned Russian billionaires and oligarchs have been frozen. That means that these assets can no longer be used by these individuals and they can't get any economic benefit from them, such as selling them or renting them, but they still legally own them. They have not been seized by governments in any of these countries. So we estimate that more than $23 billion in assets have been hit by Western sanctions since the beginning of the war. Perhaps the most prominent example is Roman Abramovich's English Premier League soccer team, Chelsea FC, which is being sold now, and the British government has said that none of the proceeds will go to Abramovich. Then another great example is Alisher Usmanov, who has been sanctioned by the EU and the UK and the US. He owns an Airbus A340-300 jet, which is blocked by the US. He also has a yacht that has been hit by sanctions in Germany. It's the largest yacht in the world and is among the at least $1.5 billion in yachts that have been hit by Western sanctions. He also owns several homes in the UK, which have been blocked by the British government, meaning that he cannot rent them or sell them, or because there's a travel ban in place against him in the UK, he can't travel there either. His homes in the UK are part of the at least $2.4 billion in real estate that has been sanctioned so far by Western authorities. It's very difficult, even for governments, to actually ascertain who owns these assets. Several of these oligarchs simply transferred ownership of their assets, such as real estate, to relatives or close associates. So as long as these individuals are able to get around the sanctions by selling certain stakes or transferring ownership, it's still difficult to see if this will actually have an impact on them long term. Of course, they can no longer travel to much of the West, and it will be very difficult for them to invest in any asset in the West. It's still an open question whether it will actually have an impact on their net worth.